San Augustine, Texas, spring 1944. Across a barbed wire fence, a German prisoner of war stood watching a young woman walk toward him. The war had brought him 6,000 miles from home, stripped him of everything but his life. She had lived her entire existence within 10 miles of this East Texas timber town, daughter of German immigrants who'd crossed an ocean seeking American soil. Neither could have imagined that their stolen conversations through chain link would ignite a scandal reaching all the way to Washington. That love between enemies would test every rule the War Department had written. The sound came first. Trucks grinding through San Augustine's main street in late April 1944, carrying lumber, canvas, barbed wire coiled like sleeping serpents. Dust rose from the unpaved roads, hanging in the humid air, settling on storefronts and the courthouse steps where old men gathered to watch history arrive in convoy form. The fairgrounds north of town, where families had watched livestock competitions just months before, transformed overnight into something else entirely. 8-man tents rose from red Texas clay. Guard towers climbed toward a sky that seemed to stretch forever, broken only by the dark line of loblolly pines marching to the horizon. Captain Walter Brooks supervised construction, his uniform already dark with sweat though the morning had barely begun. Sergeant Tony Ball and Staff Sergeant Gordon Stickle moved through the chaos, shouting orders over the hammer blows and the whine of handsaws cutting 2x4s. San Augustine had never seen anything like it. The town of 1,400 souls, nestled in the piney woods where Texas begins its slow descent toward Louisiana, had sent its young men overseas. They fought in Italy, in France, in the Pacific Islands whose names nobody could pronounce. The mothers and wives and sisters who remained behind worked double shifts at the timber mills, their hands rough from pine resin and their hearts hollowed by absence. Now the enemy was coming to them. Captain Brooks stood at the camp's entrance as the first prisoners arrived on May 12, 1944. They climbed down from army trucks blinking in the brutal East Texas sun. 331 men who'd fought for Hitler's Reich captured in the deserts of North Africa, transported across an ocean, and deposited in a landscape as foreign to them as the moon. Africa Corps veterans mostly, tanned the color of saddle leather, eyes still carrying the emptiness that comes from watching your army dissolve in surrender. Among them walked Otto Rinkenauer, 23 years old, from a small town in Germany whose name he'd repeat to himself at night like a prayer, a place with cobblestone streets and church bells that had rung for centuries, where his mother still lived in a house with window boxes full of geraniums. He'd joined the Wehrmacht because every young man in his village had. He'd fought because the alternative was a bullet. And he'd surrendered because even devotion has its limits, and his had ended somewhere in the Tunisian sand. The camp spread before him like a geometry lesson. Tents arranged in precise rows, guard towers at each corner, the soldiers inside them barely older than the prisoners themselves. A double fence of barbed wire, 10 feet high, with rolled wire along the top catching sunlight like broken teeth. Beyond it, the town. Beyond that, the endless forest. It looked nothing like home. It looked nothing like prison either. The prisoners were processed, photographed, assigned tent numbers, and they received work uniforms and were told they'd labor in the timber industry, cutting, hauling, clearing the damage from the ice storm that had struck in January, felling thousands of pines in a single frozen night. The Geneva Convention required it. The American economy needed it. And the prisoners, most of them, were grateful for the distraction. That first evening, Otto stood near the fence as twilight turned the sky purple and gold. The air smelled of pine and something else, something green and alive that reminded him how far he was from the desert where he'd spent 2 years learning to hate sand. A mockingbird sang from the top of a guard tower. Somewhere in town, a dog barked. The normalcy of it struck him like a blow. In Germany, the cities were burning. Here, children played baseball in empty lots. C. George Goetz, the camp's German translator, moved through the prisoners that evening, explaining rules in the language of their homeland. Beer would be available in the commissary. This was government property, not subject to the county's dry laws. The guards would be fair if the prisoners were obedient. Work would begin at dawn. The War Department paid the government $1.50 per prisoner per day. Each prisoner would receive 80 cents in canteen scrip. It was more than fair. It was generous. It was American. And it confused men who'd been told Americans were barbaric mongrels incapable of civilization. The propaganda had lied. Standing in a tent camp in Texas, watching guards who smiled and made jokes they couldn't understand, the prisoners began to realize the scope of the deception. Everything they'd been taught about the enemy was inverting, like a photograph in developing solution, showing them faces where they'd been promised only monsters. That first night, Otto lay on his cot and listened to the others whisper in the darkness. Some spoke of escape, hopeless fantasies of reaching Mexico, finding passage to Germany. Others wondered about their families, their villages, whether anything remained of the world they'd left behind. A few men wept quietly, ashamed of their relief. Otto didn't weep, but he wrote in the journal he'd kept since Tunisia a single line: "This is not what we were told to expect." Amelia Keitel noticed the camp before she noticed any individual prisoner. How could she not? Her family's brick house stood directly across State Highway 147 from the fairgrounds, close enough that she could hear the guards calling to each other during shift changes, close enough that the floodlights at night cast strange shadows across her bedroom wall, close enough that the presence of 300 German soldiers became as familiar as the sunrise. The Keitels had left Germany 20 years earlier, when Amelia was just a child. They'd crossed an ocean seeking the promise of Texas land, timber work, a future unencumbered by Europe's endless conflicts. Her parents spoke German at home but English in town. They'd built a life in San Augustine, purchased the brick house, planted gardens, become American in every way that mattered. Now Germany had come to their doorstep. Amelia's mother forbade her from approaching the fence. The entire town simmered with suspicion. These were Nazis, weren't they? Criminals, men who'd followed Hitler into madness. The fact that they received ice before locals in the morning, that they got cigarettes first, rankled townspeople already stretched thin by rationing and absence. But Amelia, 18 years old and restless with the particular loneliness that comes from watching all the young men disappear to war, couldn't help her curiosity. She first saw Otto Rinkenauer on a Saturday afternoon in late May. He stood near the fence, hands in his pockets, watching the road with the expression of someone trying to memorize distance. He wasn't imposing, average height, sandy hair, features that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. But something in his posture spoke of a profound displacement, a man standing on one continent while his thoughts remained anchored to another. She didn't approach him. Not that day, but she noticed him, and in noticing began to see. The camp established rhythms. Trucks arrived before dawn to transport prisoners to timber sites deep in the Angelina National Forest. They returned at dusk, the men covered in sawdust and pine resin, exhausted in the way that physical labor exhausts, leaving the mind oddly clear. On Sundays, the prisoners organized soccer games in an open area near the mess tent. They sang German songs that carried across the fence into town, melancholy melodies that sounded nothing like marching anthems. Amelia walked past the fence on her way to the general store. She walked past on her way to church. She walked past because walking past had become habit, and habits are what sustain us when everything else feels uncertain. One afternoon in June, she stopped. Otto stood at the fence, and this time he wasn't alone. 3 other prisoners clustered nearby, talking quietly in German. When Amelia appeared on the road, their conversation died. For a long moment, no one moved. The heat shimmered between them like something alive. Then Otto spoke, his English broken but understandable. "Hello." Just that. One word. But it crossed the distance between prisoner and civilian, between German and American, between 2 young people who'd been taught to hate each other and instead found themselves simply curious. "Hello," Amelia replied. The other prisoners drifted away, tactful in the way young men can be when they recognize something forming. Otto and Amelia stood on opposite sides of barbed wire, neither certain what came next. "You live there?" He gestured toward the brick house. "Yes. It's a good house, sturdy. My parents built it." "German?" She hesitated. Then, "They came from Germany, a long time ago." Otto's face changed, not quite a smile, but something softer than the careful blankness he'd worn since arriving. "You speak German?" "A little, at home." They talked for 15 minutes. About nothing. About everything. About the weather, which in East Texas summer meant talking about heat that pressed down like a physical weight. About the pines, which reminded Otto of black forest regions he'd never seen but heard about. About the ice storm in January, which Amelia described while Otto listened with the intensity of someone storing every word against future loneliness. A guard walked past and they fell silent. When he moved on, they resumed, voices lower now, aware they were testing boundaries whose exact locations remained unclear. "I should go," Amelia finally said. "Will you—" Otto paused, searching for English words. "Will you come again?" She should have said no. Every rule of propriety, every wartime instruction about trusting the enemy, every protective instinct her parents had installed, all of it demanded she walk away and not return. Instead, she said, "Maybe." She came back the next day, and the day after, and the day after that. The conversations lengthened. Otto's English improved, fed by dictionaries he borrowed from the camp's small library. Amelia brought him small things, books mostly, passed through the fence when guards weren't watching. Nothing prohibited it explicitly, but the act felt subversive nonetheless. They talked about their lives before the war, carefully editing out the politics that had made them enemies. He told her about his village, the apprenticeship he'd abandoned to enlist, the mother who sent letters that never reached him. She told him about San Augustine, the isolation of small-town life, the strange experience of German heritage in an American war. They discovered they were both lonely. And loneliness, they learned, speaks a universal language. By July, Otto Rinkenauer and Amelia Keidel were in love. They never called it that, not aloud, not to each other. The word carried implications too dangerous to voice. But it lived in the way Otto positioned himself near the fence during free hours, hoping she might appear. It lived in the way Amelia chose her walking routes, in the quickening of her pulse when she spotted his figure among the prisoners. It lived in stolen glances and careful words and the unbearable ache of proximity divided by wire. The other prisoners noticed. Some teased Otto gently, calling him the luckiest man in Camp San Augustine. Others warned him. Fraternization was forbidden, loosely defined but strictly forbidden nonetheless. If the camp authorities discovered anything beyond casual conversation, he could be transferred. She could face legal consequences. The War Department took such matters seriously. But the heart, once awakened, rarely listens to warnings. One evening in August, Otto passed a letter through the fence. Amelia took it, slipping it into her pocket before any guards noticed. She read it that night by candlelight in her bedroom, 3 pages of careful English, declaring emotions he couldn't risk speaking aloud. She kept it in a box beneath her bed, alongside 4 others that followed. The timber industry consumed the prisoners. Each morning before sunrise, trucks carried them deep into forests where pine trees grew so thick, the sunlight arrived in shafts and columns. They worked alongside Mexican laborers and the few local men too old or infirm for military service, clearing storm damage, cutting timber for the war effort, loading logs onto rail cars bound for mills. The work was hard. The work was honest. The work was better than war. Otto learned to handle a 2-man saw, the rhythm of push-pull-push becoming meditative in its repetition. His hands, which had held rifles and grenades, now gripped axe handles and cant hooks. He grew stronger, the desert war's gauntness filling out with muscle earned from labor. At night he fell asleep instantly, too tired for nightmares. But tired or not, he thought of Amelia. The camp operated efficiently. Captain Brooks ran it with firm fairness, understanding that treating prisoners well served strategic purposes, good treatment for American POWs overseas, rehabilitation of men who'd returned to rebuild Germany. The prisoners organized educational classes, teaching each other English and engineering and mathematics. They formed a small orchestra that played on Sunday evenings, melancholy waltzes and folk songs that drifted across the fence into town. Some townspeople softened, others hardened. Mrs. Henderson at the general store refused to serve anyone who'd spoken kindly about the prisoners. Mr. Jackson, whose son had died at Normandy, would cross the street rather than walk past the camp. But the barber, Mr. Collins, admitted quietly to trusted friends that the Germans seemed like decent boys caught in circumstances beyond their control. The divisions ran deep. Patriotism and grief and propaganda had tangled together into something that couldn't be easily sorted. For every person who saw enemy soldiers, another saw young men who looked tired and homesick, and not particularly different from the boys who'd left San Augustine wearing American uniforms. Amelia felt the town's judgment before anyone spoke directly to her. Small things first. Conversations stopping when she entered the store. Sidelong glances. Mrs. Patterson at church moving her seat to avoid sitting near the Keitel family. Amelia's mother noticed, worried but said nothing. What could she say? The camp was unavoidable. The prisoners a fact of daily life. Speaking German at home suddenly felt treasonous. Then came the direct confrontations. Betty Lawson, whose fiancé was stationed in France, cornered Amelia outside the post office in September. "I see you," Betty said, voice low but sharp, walking past that fence every day, smiling at those Nazis. "They're not all—" "They're the enemy," Betty interrupted. "While our boys are dying over there, you're making eyes at the men trying to kill them." "I'm not—" But Betty had already walked away, leaving Amelia standing alone with her cheeks burning and her heart hammering. The whispers intensified. Amelia couldn't go anywhere without feeling the weight of watching eyes. Her parents, learning of the gossip, forbade her from approaching the fence. They were frightened, not of the prisoners but of their neighbors, of losing the American identity they'd worked 20 years to build. "We left Germany to escape this," her father said one night at dinner, voice heavy. "We came here to be American. Don't make us regret it." Amelia obeyed. For 3 days she stayed away from the fence. On the 4th day, she went back. Otto was waiting. He'd been waiting every day, watching the road, hoping. When he saw her, his face transformed, relief and joy and something like pain all mixed together. "I thought—" He couldn't finish. "I'm sorry," she said. "They forbid me, my parents, the town, everyone. Then you shouldn't be here." "I know." They stood in silence, the fence between them. The weight of their situation finally undeniable. Two young people who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love during the wrong war, in the wrong place, on the wrong sides of history. "When the war ends," Otto said quietly, "I'll be sent home." "I know. But I'll come back. If you'll wait for me, I'll come back." It was a promise made across barbed wire, in the shadow of guard towers, with the whole world telling them it was impossible. It was also the truest thing either of them had said. "I'll wait," Amelia whispered. The War Department monitored POW camps with bureaucratic efficiency. Reports flowed from Camp San Augustine to Camp Fannin in Tyler, the base camp that oversaw all East Texas facilities. From there, they traveled to the office of the Provost Marshal General in Washington, where officials tracked everything from escape attempts to labor productivity to morale issues. Fraternization topped the list of concerns. The military had learned harsh lessons about prisoner-civilian interactions. In camps across America, stories emerged. German POWs attending local dances, dating American women, proposing marriage. Some women helped prisoners escape. Others simply fell in love, complicating repatriation efforts and inflaming public opinion. The War Department feared both security breaches and public backlash. In August 1944, a routine inspection noted excessive familiarity between a local civilian and prisoner, MOR 4582. Prisoner NAR 4582 was Otto Rinkenauer. The report came from a guard who'd observed repeated conversations at the fence. Nothing illegal had occurred. No physical contact, no exchange of prohibited materials. But the frequency and duration of interactions raised flags. The guard noted it in his daily log. His sergeant included it in the weekly report. The report reached Captain Brooks's desk. Brooks called Otto to his office. I understand you've been talking to a local girl, Brooks said, not unkindly. Otto said nothing. Son, I'm not here to make your life difficult, but fraternization is prohibited. You know this. We only talk, Otto replied, meeting the captain's eyes. I believe you, but it looks bad. To the town, to Washington. There are people who'd like any excuse to make examples, and you're giving them one. I'll stop. Will you? Brooks studied him. Because I've seen men in love before. They don't stop just because someone tells them to. Otto remained silent. Brooks sighed. I'm giving you a warning. 1. Stay away from that fence when you're not working, understand? Yes, sir. But Otto didn't stop. Neither did Amelia. They simply became more careful. The inspections increased. In September, a team from the Provost Marshal General's office arrived unannounced, interviewing guards, reviewing logs, watching the fence line. They noted improved security measures needed but found no overt violations. The Texas camps produced particularly high numbers of returnees. Something about the landscape, the treatment, the unexpected hospitality of a place that logically should have been hostile. It left impressions that lasted. Former prisoners returned for reunions decades later, bringing their families, showing their children where they'd spent years learning that propaganda lied and that kindness could exist even between combatants. Washington's concern about fraternization proved both warranted and overblown. Yes, relationships complicated repatriation. Yes, some women helped prisoners escape. Yes, public opinion reacted badly to images of American girls dating German soldiers while American boys died overseas. But the larger story was more complex. The POW program, including its fraternization problems, accomplished something strategic planners hadn't fully anticipated. It showed German soldiers that Americans weren't the barbaric enemy described in Nazi propaganda. It planted seeds of democratic values that prisoners carried home to a shattered nation needing reconstruction. It turned potential enemies into friends, or at least into people who no longer believed the lies that made war possible. The romance between a German prisoner and an American woman of German descent, played out in a small East Texas town, became a tiny thread in a larger tapestry of reconciliation. Otto Rinkenauer lived in San Augustine until his death in 1989. He and Amelia raised 3 children, all born American, all taught both German and English. The motel they built employed locals, served travelers, became a fixture in town. By the 1960s, nobody much cared anymore about the scandal of their meeting. By the 1980s, it was a charming story, softened by time and the knowledge that their love had lasted. When researchers from the Texas Historical Commission interviewed Otto in 1983, he spoke carefully about his time as a POW. He acknowledged the complicated position of German soldiers, neither victims nor pure villains, but young men caught in circumstances that exceeded their understanding or control. He expressed gratitude for his treatment, for the fairness of his captivity, for the strange mercy of being sent to Texas rather than a Russian camp where he'd likely have died. And he spoke of Amelia, the girl across the fence who'd violated every wartime rule by seeing him as human. The war taught me to hate, he said in that interview. But Texas taught me something else. It taught me that the world is larger than any one country's propaganda. That people are just people, trying to survive, trying to find connection in the middle of chaos. He paused, looking out the window of the motel office toward the spot where Camp San Augustine once stood. Washington worried about fraternization, he continued. They thought it threatened security. But maybe it did something more important. Maybe it reminded us that even in war, love matters, especially in war. The fairgrounds where Camp San Augustine once stood are now home to the rodeo arena and the high school practice field. The guard towers are gone. The barbed wire is gone. The tents that housed 300 German soldiers have dissolved into Texas heat and memory. But if you know where to look, you can still find traces. Concrete foundations hidden in grass, a rusted fence post. The brick house across Highway 147 where the Keidel family lived, still standing, still occupied. And Keidel's motel, modest and functional, its sign visible from the road, a monument to the idea that love doesn't care about borders, that connection transcends conflict, that two young people separated by war can find each other and build something lasting. When Otto Rinkenauer died, he was buried in San Augustine cemetery, far from the German village where he was born, far from the African desert where he surrendered. American soil held his remains, the ground he'd chosen through love rather than birth. Amelia outlived him by 15 years. She ran the motel until she couldn't anymore, then passed it to her children, who pass it now to their children. She spoke at historical society meetings, patient with researchers wanting to understand the POW camps, the relationships, the fraternization that so concerned Washington. They worried about rules, she said once near the end of her life. But Otto and I weren't breaking rules. We were just two people trying to be human in a time that made humanity difficult. The last German POW camp in Texas closed in 1946. But the echoes of those camps, the friendships formed, the marriages built, the reconciliation begun across barbed wire, those echoes lasted generations. In the end, Washington found out about Otto and Amelia. Found out, documented it, worried about it, added it to reports that gathered dust in archives. But Washington also learned something, that the human heart won't be contained by policy, that love finds ways through any obstacle, and that sometimes, not always, but sometimes connection matters more than conflict. The war ended. The prisoners went home. Except for the ones who didn't, who chose instead to return to the place where they had learned that enemies were just people wearing different uniforms, speaking different languages, loving the same things. Otto came back, and in coming back, proved that some fences exist only in our minds, waiting to be crossed by those brave enough to try.